Rich kids tore a female SEAL's uniform laughing. Then her K-9 walked in, and the room went silent. An October cold front had moved through Newport, Rhode Island the night before, and left the sky above Bellevue Avenue clean and hard, and the kind of dark blue that belonged to late fall and open ocean. And the lights of Marble House were already burning gold against it at 6 in the evening when Saoirse Callahan walked up the front steps in her dress uniform with Fable at her left side. The Belgian Malinois was pale fawn, nearly cream, with a black service vest and the particular quality of attention that working dogs carried in public. Not alertness, which implied surprise, but the steady, continuous awareness of an animal for whom there was no such thing as background. Riss had the program from the door in her hand and was comparing it, in the East Gallery before dinner, to the photograph on her phone of the advanced program she had been shown 3 days ago. And the difference between the two was the reason her jaw had set the way it set when she had found something that was wrong and needed to be dealt with. She was still studying the two programs when she became aware of the 3 young men to her right, and then heard one of them say to the others, in the voice people use when they're performing for an audience of their own kind, "It's a costume thing, right? Like women in uniform as a whole." And one of them reached out and flicked the ribbon cluster on Riss's chest with 2 fingers the way you flick something you're not taking seriously. And the third laughed. Fable turned. She stepped in front of Riss, faced the 3 men, and sat, perfectly, absolutely still, looking at them with the yellow-green eyes of an animal that had already completed its assessment and had simply stopped being patient about the result. The laughter stopped. The room, in the particular way rooms respond to something shifting in their register, went quiet. What happened next in that gallery, and what Saoirse Callahan uncovered in the 40 minutes before the dinner program began, would surface an act of institutional erasure that had been running for 3 weeks against a woman who had spent 50 years making the kind of sacrifice that rooms like this one had been built to honor? Stay with me for this one. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is what this channel does. And there are more stories coming. Riss had become a Navy SEAL in 2018, 2 years after the combat integration order that made it possible, and she had done it the way she did everything, which was by treating the obstacles as information rather than arguments, each one telling her something about the terrain that she could use to navigate the next. She had grown up in Providence, Rhode Island, the daughter of an Irish immigrant father who worked marine electrical repair at the Newport shipyard and a mother who had been a surgical nurse for 31 years, and she had inherited from both of them a combination of mechanical precision and a very high tolerance for the specific discomfort of doing necessary things in difficult conditions. She had been an MP before selection, then a special operations support element, and had been among the first women to go through the full SEAL qualification pipeline, which she had completed at 31 after 2 attempts, the second of which she had finished with a stress fracture in her right foot that she had not reported because reporting it would have ended the attempt, and she had decided that the foot could be addressed when the attempt was complete. She had deployed twice, had her Bronze Star from the second deployment for an action she did not discuss at dinner parties, and had been medically retired at 36 when a training injury separated her left shoulder in a way that 3 surgeries had not fully resolved. She had accepted the retirement with the same precision she applied to everything else, identifying what remained, assessing what had changed, building the next version of her operational life from what was available. She worked 3 days a week as a transition counselor at the Newport VA. She lived in a second-floor apartment near the harbor. She had Fable. Fable had come to her 14 months ago, and the relationship between them had the quality of a very good working partnership. Mutual respect, clear roles, no ambiguity about who was responsible for what. Riss monitored Fable's needs. Fable monitored Riss's nervous system. In the high-stimulus environments that had become difficult after Riss's second deployment, crowded rooms, loud, unpredictable, full of people moving in the compressed social patterns of events, Fable's presence was the thing that kept Riss's baseline from climbing into a range that cost her the next day. She had come tonight because Admiral Holt had asked her to come, personally, in a handwritten note that had arrived at the VA 3 weeks ago. And Riss had looked at that note for a long time before she said yes. Admiral Frances Holt had been the first woman to reach flag rank in the United States Navy and had retired in 1997 after 40 years of service that had included 2 sea commands, 3 tours in the Pentagon, and a 1976 testimony before the Naval Personnel Committee that had argued with the precision of a woman who knew exactly where she was and what she was doing, that the Navy's exclusion of women from expanded combat and command roles was a strategic liability, not a cultural preference. She had not been thanked for this testimony. She had been called into the office of a two-star the following morning and advised to consider the effects of public advocacy on a career still in its formative stages, which was the polite language of an institution telling her that the door she had just tried to open was going to stay closed if she kept touching the handle. She had nodded and returned to her duties and had not stopped touching the handle. She had simply learned to be more precise about how she did it. She had spent the next 20 years making herself impossible to remove, rising through command billets and joint assignments and Pentagon posts that required her to be excellent in spaces where excellence was the only argument that could not be dismissed. And she had been excellent in all of them, and she had been promoted at each competitive zone. And at each promotion, the institution had absorbed what she forced it to absorb and had moved on without particularly noting who had done the forcing. She had reached flag rank in 1995 and had retired 2 years later, and the ceremony had been attended by 160 people, including 3 admirals and a secretary of the Navy who had said correct things in the correct order and had meant them, and then the institution had gone about its business. She was 84 now and lived in a narrow federal-style house on Thames Street, 3 blocks from the harbor, alone, with a large collection of naval history books and a garden she tended herself from April through October, and a mind that had not slowed in any way she would acknowledge, or that Riss, in their first meeting, could detect. She had white hair she wore simply, and the bearing of a woman who had spent 40 years in rooms where her presence required a justification that no one else in the room had to provide, and who had provided that justification so many times and so thoroughly that the requirement itself had simply stopped applying to her, the way a law stops applying when it becomes sufficiently absurd. She accepted the absurdity without bitterness and without performance, which was, Riss thought, the most extraordinary quality she possessed. Riss had met her for the first time at tea 3 days ago, at a small table in Admiral Holt's front parlor with the harbor visible through the window and Fable asleep on the rug and the advanced gala program on the table between them. The parlor was the kind of room that accumulated meaning over many years. Books in double rows on shelves that had run out of space, a model of a destroyer in a glass case, framed photographs that Riss recognized as fleet commands, and ceremony days in the specific formal compositions of a naval career going back to the Kennedy administration. The Admiral had set out a proper tea with cups and a plate of shortbread, which Riss understood was not ceremony but standard. This was how Admiral Holt received guests, and Riss was a guest, and the standard applied regardless. The tribute had been in the advanced program, a 2-minute video drawn from archival footage, a named scholarship in the Admiral's honor endowed at the Naval War College, a citation that Riss had read and found exactly right, the kind of language that said true things without ornament. The Admiral had talked about Riss's record with the directness that came from having read it carefully and completely, and had asked 3 questions about the second deployment that told Riss she understood the operational context at a level that most civilians never reached. She had asked about the shoulder. She had asked about the transition counseling work at the VA and what Riss found useful about it and what she found insufficient. She had not asked about the Bronze Star, which was the question everyone asked and which always required the answer Riss was not going to give. And its absence told Riss something about the Admiral that confirmed everything she had already believed. Before Riss left, the Admiral had said without ceremony, looking at her over the rim of her teacup, "I'm glad you exist." Riss had driven home and sat in her truck for 10 minutes before going inside. The program in her hand at the East Gallery had no tribute, no video, no named scholarship, no citation. No mention of Admiral Francis Holt's name anywhere in the document except in the small print list of distinguished guests at the back. Have you ever found evidence that something important had been quietly erased and understood, and the moment of finding it that no one was going to notice unless you did something? Tell me in the comments. I think more people have had this moment than know what to do with it. The 3 young men had not looked at the program. They had not, Riss suspected, looked at much that evening beyond the open bar and each other. The one who had flicked her ribbon, she had him placed now. From the name tag at the door, Carson Hale, 23, Newport by way of Andover, and a year at Georgetown, was looking at Fable with the expression of someone who had expected a laugh to follow and had gotten silence instead. The silence was worse. Fable had not moved. She was sitting with her full weight settled, looking at the three of them with the particular patience of a dog who knows she has already won and is simply waiting for the other party to understand it. Riss looked at Carson Hale. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Bradford Hale arrived from the main hall. He was 51, broad-shouldered, 2 weeks past an election win for Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District, with the specific confidence of a man who had just been given a large room to fill and was still feeling the size of it. He looked at the scene in the East Gallery, his son, the two others, the woman in dress uniform, the dog, and made the calculation that Riss had seen powerful men make dozens of times. The calculation between what was right and what was convenient, completed in about 2 seconds. He introduced himself with a handshake extended to Riss and said there seemed to be some kind of misunderstanding, that the boys had been joking around, that it was a festive evening and people were in high spirits, and that he was sure she understood. Fable stood up. She placed herself between Riss and Bradford Hale, with the unhurried deliberateness of a dog who has been watching a situation for its entire duration and has just made a final assessment. The growl was low and unbroken and absolute, and Bradford Hale stopped mid-sentence and looked at the dog in the way that people who have been managing rooms for a long time look at something that cannot be managed. Riss said she appreciated the introduction. She said she had a question about the gala program. She held up both programs, the advance copy on her phone screen, the print copy in her hand, and she said that the tribute to Admiral Francis Holt, including the name scholarship and the video citation, appeared to have been removed from the print program, and that she was trying to understand when that decision had been made, and by whom. The gallery had been listening. Rooms like this one always listened, even when they appeared not to. Bradford said that was a foundation matter and that the program committee made those decisions and that this wasn't the time or place. Admiral Holt came through the gallery door. She had been in the reception room down the hall and had heard her name, or had heard the particular quality of a silence that meant her name was at the center of something. She was wearing a navy blue dress and the metal ribbons of a rear admiral on her lapel, and she walked into the gallery with the specific posture of a woman who did not enter rooms. She occupied them, who had been doing so for 50 years and saw no reason to stop. She looked at the two programs in Riss's hands. She looked at Bradford Hale. She said it in the voice she had used in committee rooms and at sea, and in every room where she had been required to state an obvious truth that people were pretending not to see. Quietly, with no space in it for an alternative interpretation, you removed my name from the program. Bradford started to say something about the Foundation's editorial process. Fable's growl dropped half a register. She had turned her full attention to Bradford when he spoke, and the specific change in the sound she made, lower, more deliberate, the register of an animal that has moved past warning into something that had made a decision, cleared the space around Bradford in a way that no human action could have achieved. He stopped. His son took a step backward. The gallery was completely still. Riss said she had sent an email 40 minutes ago to the Newport Naval Heritage Foundation's executive director with both program versions attached and a request for a written explanation, and that she had copied the Naval War College's Community Relations Office and the Newport Daily News. She said this wasn't about the gala. She said it was about the record. That the record of this evening would show what was and was not said, and that she preferred it to show the right things. She said Admiral Holt was going to be recognized tonight, and that the question was whether the Foundation was going to do it voluntarily or whether Riss was going to stand at the dinner podium during the open remarks portion of the program, which she had confirmed with the event coordinator was still available, and read the citation herself from the advanced program on her phone. She said this without raising her voice because her voice was not the point. The evidence was the point. Bradford Hale looked at the room. He looked at his son. He looked at Admiral Holt, who was watching him with the patience of a woman who had been waiting for rooms like this one to do the right thing for most of her adult life and had learned to wait without losing either her temper or her precision. He said he would speak with the Foundation director. He left. Fable watched him go. She held her position until he had crossed through the main hall door and it had closed. Then she turned and walked back to Riss's left side and sat, and her tail moved once, and the room began to breathe again. The Foundation director, reached by Bradford Hale in the next 20 minutes, restored the tribute to the dinner program. The video had not been deleted. It had been archived, which was how things that are meant to disappear or disappeared in institutions that want to deny the intent. It played at 7:45 before the main course in a room of 240 people who watched an 84-year-old woman's 40 years of service cataloged in 2 minutes with the precision and respect it had always deserved and had not always received. The video was 3 minutes and 12 seconds. It began with the 1976 testimony, a clip Riss had never seen. Grainy archival footage of a younger Frances Holt at a committee table in a room full of men, speaking in the level-exact voice that Riss recognized from T3 days ago, unchanged by 48 years. It showed her C commands, her Pentagon postings, her promotion ceremony. It ended on a recent photograph, the Admiral in her garden on Thames Street, in the late summer in civilian clothes, looking at the camera with the expression of someone who has done what they came to do and is at peace with how it turned out. When the video finished, Riss stood up and started clapping. The room followed. It took about 2 seconds. Admiral Holt sat very straight through all of it. She looked at the screen for a moment after the video ended, and then at her hands, and then she looked up at the room that was on its feet for her, and her expression was the expression of someone receiving something they had quietly stopped expecting and had not stopped deserving. She nodded once, a small, formal nod. The nod of a woman who accepts what is owed without making a performance of the receiving. And then she looked across the room and found Riss's face, and held it for a moment, and what passed between them in that look was not gratitude, exactly, or not only gratitude, but the specific recognition between two people who have been in similar rooms for similar reasons and understand, without needing to say it, what it costs to stay standing in them. Reverend Miles Ashworth from Trinity Church was seated 3 tables from the Admiral, and he was on his feet with everyone else. And he caught Riss's eye across the room and gave her a small nod that contained everything such nods contained, from someone who had just watched something right finally happen. Bradford Hale was not in the room. He had left after speaking with the foundation director, which was the choice of a man who understood that the calculation had gone the wrong way and preferred to be absent from the conclusion. The foundation's executive director issued a statement the following morning citing a production error that had been corrected. 3 members of the foundation board sent personal apologies to Admiral Holt by the end of the week. The Admiral accepted each one with the grace she applied to everything, and the precision of someone who had been accepting inadequate apologies from institutions for 50 years and had gotten very good at receiving them without surrendering anything. Carson Hale sent no apology. What happened to him that evening, Riss thought, was more lasting than an apology would have been. He had stood in a gallery in a Gilded Age mansion and had been shown, by a dog sitting in perfect stillness and a woman who did not step back, what the ribbons were actually for. Whether that knowledge changed anything was his work to do, not hers. After the dinner, Riss found Admiral Holt on the mansion's south terrace, looking out at the harbor. The October air had dropped into the 40s, and the Admiral's shawl was not enough for it. Riss took off her dress uniform jacket and laid it across the Admiral's shoulders without asking. And the Admiral looked at it and then at Riss and said, with the dry precision that was her version of warmth, "You earned every thread of this." Riss said she'd had help. The Admiral was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's what it's for." And the 3 of them stood in the cold harbor air with the lights of Newport below them and the black October Atlantic beyond. And nobody said anything for a while because nothing needed to be said. The door Riss had walked through had been built by this woman's hands 40 years before Riss was old enough to reach it. Riss had known this in an abstract way since her commanding officer first told her Admiral Holt's name. She had known it more specifically after reading the 1976 testimony. She understood it differently now, not as history, not as biography, but as the specific weight of a debt that could not be paid, but could be carried forward. The way a patch carried a division's history forward through every person who wore it. She had stood in a gallery that evening and been the next person in a line that had started with a woman who had gone alone into rooms that didn't want her, and had done the work anyway, for 40 years, without being thanked, on the precise understanding that the point was not to be thanked, but to open the door. She had stood at the door. She had not moved. This story is for every woman who built something she never got to see the full result of, who opened a door and kept walking and trusted that someone would come through it eventually. And for every person who understands, even now, what the ribbons are for. Is there a woman in your life who opened a door you walked through? A teacher, a mentor, a trailblazer who never got the recognition she earned? Tell me about her in the comments. I read everyone. This section deserves her name. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe, so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.